I watched the poison work its way through my father's system, each labored breath a symphony of justice. The doctors called it an aggressive neurological condition of unknown origin, but I knew better. I knew exactly what was killing him, and more importantly, I knew how to stop it. But I wouldn't, not after what he did to my mother. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I sat in the same hospital chair where I'd watched her waste away 23 years ago, powerless and desperate. But this time was different. This time, I held all the cards. "Sarah, thank God you're here," my father wheezed, his once commanding voice reduced to a pathetic rasp. "The doctors. They don't know what's wrong with me, but you're so smart, you always were. Maybe you could research something, find a specialist." I squeezed his hand gently, letting false comfort leak into my voice. "Of course, Dad, I'll do everything I can." Everything except save him. The memories of my previous life crashed over me like a tidal wave, as vivid and sharp as the day I'd died. I remembered the car accident at 35, the brief moment of impact, and then waking up as my 5-year-old self with 29 years of knowledge intact. Most people would call it impossible. I called it providence. In my first life, I discovered the truth too late. My mother hadn't died of a rare autoimmune disease, as my father claimed. She'd been systematically poisoned with thallium, a heavy metal that mimics autoimmune symptoms perfectly when administered in small doses over time. By the time I'd pieced it together, she'd been dead for 15 years, and my father had already spent her life insurance money and inheritance on his secretary-turned-second wife. But the universe, it seemed, had given me a second chance. I'd spent 18 years preparing for this moment. 18 years of being the perfect daughter while secretly orchestrating his downfall. Medical school, where I specialized in toxicology. Building relationships with the right people. Positioning myself as his primary caregiver when his health inevitably declined. And now, watching him suffer the same slow, agonizing death he'd inflicted on my mother, I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "The numbness in your hands is getting worse, isn't it?" I asked, noting the way he fumbled with his water glass. "Yes," he admitted, shame coloring his features. "And my vision. Sometimes I see double." Textbook thallium poisoning. I should know. I'd been administering it for 6 months. The plan had been years in the making, but the execution was beautifully simple. As his doctor daughter, I had unlimited access to his food, his medications, his entire life. A few milligrams of thallium sulfate mixed into his blood pressure medication. Undetectable unless someone specifically tested for it, which they wouldn't unless they had reason to suspect poisoning. And who would suspect the devoted daughter who'd moved back home to care for her aging father? "Dr. Matthews wants to run more tests," Dad continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I'm scared, Sarah. What if it's something terrible? What if I'm dying?" "You're not dying, Dad," I lied smoothly. "We'll figure this out." But even as I comforted him, my mind was cataloging his symptoms with clinical precision. The peripheral neuropathy was progressing nicely. His hair had started thinning, another telltale sign. Soon would come the more severe neurological symptoms: confusion, difficulty walking, eventually complete incapacitation. Just like Mom, I thought back to that pivotal moment 3 months into my second life, when I was 8 years old and had walked into my parents' bedroom to find my father mixing white powder into my mother's evening tea. In my first life, I'd been too young to understand. This time, I'd known exactly what I was witnessing. The rage that consumed me in that moment had been pure and clarifying. I'd wanted to scream, to run to my mother, to call the police. But I was 8 years old in a 5-year-old's body with no proof and no power. So instead, I'd retreated to my room and began planning a revenge that would take 2 decades to fully unfold. I documented everything. Every dose I witnessed him give her. Every lie he told the doctors about her symptoms. Every tender moment he performed for the cameras while slowly murdering his wife. And when she finally died, again, I was ready. The funeral was a masterpiece of performance art. I played the grieving daughter perfectly, even as I memorized the names of every person who offered their condolences. Future witnesses to my father's own demise. "You were such a comfort to your mother in her final days," Pastor Williams had said, not knowing he was speaking to a woman who'd already lived through this loss once. "She raised me to be strong," I'd replied, already planning how I'd use that strength. The years that followed were a careful balance of building my new life while staying close enough to monitor my father. I excelled in school, earned a full scholarship to medical school, and specialized in the exact field that would make me most dangerous to him. Meanwhile, I watched him enjoy his blood money, the new house he bought with mom's life insurance, the expensive vacations with wife number two, the way he rewrote history, painting himself as a devoted husband who'd done everything he could to save his beloved spouse. It made me sick, but it also made me patient. I'd learned the value of timing in my previous life. Rushing leads to mistakes. True revenge requires careful orchestration, perfect timing, and absolutely no room for error. So I waited. I built my reputation as a brilliant toxicologist. I published papers on heavy metal poisoning that would later become reference materials for the very doctors treating my father. I cultivated relationships with law enforcement, establishing myself as an expert witness in poisoning cases, all while playing the role of the dutiful daughter who'd overcome the tragedy of losing her mother young. My father had remarried quickly, within 18 months of mom's death. Linda was 15 years younger, beautiful in a generic sort of way, and impressed by his money. She'd made a few half-hearted attempts to bond with me over the years, but I'd kept her at arm's length. No point in getting attached to someone who'd be a widow soon enough. The poisoning had begun 6 months ago, timed perfectly with his 60th birthday. I'd convinced him to let me manage his medications. Doctor in the family, I'd joked, and he'd been touched by my concern for his health. If only he knew how much I truly cared about his condition. The first symptoms appeared after 2 weeks. Mild fatigue, which he attributed to stress from work. Then came the occasional nausea, which he blamed on Linda's cooking. I played the concerned daughter beautifully, suggesting he see his doctor, offering to go with him to appointments. "You're such a good daughter," he'd said after his first round of inconclusive tests. "Your mother would be so proud." The mention of my mother had nearly broken my careful composure, but I'd smiled and squeezed his hand, already calculating how much thallium would be in his system by the next blood draw. Dr. Matthews was a competent physician, but like most doctors, he was thinking horses when he heard hoofbeats. The symptoms could indicate a dozen different conditions, and thallium poisoning wouldn't even make the top 50 unless someone specifically suggested it, which no one would, except perhaps another toxicologist. The real beauty of my plan wasn't just the poisoning itself. It was the comprehensive nature of my revenge. I hadn't simply wanted my father to die. I'd wanted him to suffer the same helplessness and fear he'd inflicted on my mother. I wanted him to feel his body failing him piece by piece, to lie awake at night wondering what was wrong with him, to depend on others for care he didn't deserve. But more than that, I wanted justice. Real, meaningful justice that went beyond just his death. 3 months into his illness, when his symptoms were becoming too obvious to ignore, I'd placed an anonymous call to the police. A concerned citizen who'd noticed some inconsistencies in the death of Mrs. Catherine Brennan 23 years prior. Maybe they should take another look at the case, especially given her husband's recent similar symptoms. The beauty of having contacts in law enforcement was knowing exactly which detective would be most likely to pursue a cold case with renewed vigor. Detective Maria Santos had a reputation for thoroughness and a personal history with domestic violence cases. When I'd anonymously sent her copies of my mother's medical records alongside research papers about thallium poisoning, she'd taken the bait beautifully. Within a week, they'd exhumed my mother's body. After 23 years, there wouldn't be much left, but thallium accumulates in hair and bone tissue. There would be enough evidence to prove murder. I'd made sure of it. "Sarah?" My father's voice pulled me back to the present. His condition had deteriorated significantly over the past month. The tremors in his hands were constant now, and his speech was becoming slurred. "There's something I need to tell you, in case something happens to me." Here it comes, I thought. The deathbed confession. In my experience studying criminal psychology, guilt was a powerful motivator when facing mortality. Even the most sociopathic individuals often sought absolution as death approached. "What is it, Dad?" He struggled to sit up straighter, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's about your mother, about how she really died." My heart rate spiked, though I kept my expression neutral. After 23 years of lies, was he finally ready to tell the truth? I know what the doctor said about the autoimmune disease, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. But that's not what killed her. I leaned closer, playing the concerned daughter. What do you mean? The words that followed were everything I'd hoped for and more. A full confession, delivered in halting, guilt-ridden sentences. How he'd been having an affair with Linda for 2 years before Mom's death. How the divorce would have cost him everything: the house, his business, the majority of his assets. How he'd researched methods that would look like natural illness. I never meant for it to take so long, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I thought it would be quick, peaceful, but she suffered, Sarah. She suffered so much, and I couldn't stop it without confessing, he meant, without destroying the life he'd built on her corpse. I started with small amounts, he continued, his voice growing weaker. Just a little bit in her vitamins. The research said it would be like falling asleep, but it wasn't. God, it wasn't. I remembered those final months with crystal clarity now. The way Mom's beautiful auburn hair had fallen out in clumps. How she'd lost sensation in her fingers and toes, then her hands and feet. The confusion that had set in near the end when she couldn't remember my name or recognize her own reflection. She begged me to take her to better doctors, Dad continued, lost in his confession now. She said something was wrong, that the symptoms didn't match what Dr. Patterson was telling her. Oh, she was so smart, your mother. Too smart for her own good. Too smart to accept a misdiagnosis, he meant. Too observant not to notice that her illness didn't follow any known pattern. She'd started asking questions, demanding second opinions, researching her symptoms on her own. That's when I knew I had to accelerate things, he whispered. She was getting suspicious. She found the thallium compound in my desk drawer 3 days before she died. She confronted me, Sarah. She knew. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. In all my years of planning revenge, I'd never known that Mom had figured it out. She'd known her husband was murdering her, and she'd been powerless to stop it. What did she say? I asked, my voice barely steady. She said she forgave me. Dad's voice broke completely. Can you believe that? I was killing her, and she said she forgave me. She begged me to get help, to turn myself in, to do the right thing. She said she'd stand by me if I confessed. Of course she had. That was who my mother was, loving and forgiving to a fault. Even facing her own murder, she'd tried to save the man destroying her. But I couldn't, he continued. I was too much of a coward. So I gave her a massive dose that night, enough to make sure she wouldn't wake up the next morning. She knew what was happening. She looked at me, and she knew. The image of my mother's final moments, aware, terrified, betrayed by the man she'd loved and forgiven, seared itself into my mind. Whatever sympathy I might have felt for my father's current suffering evaporated completely. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because I'm dying, he said simply, and because I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. And because... He paused, gathering strength. Because I need you to forgive me. Like she did. The audacity of it was breathtaking. After everything he'd done, murdering my mother, stealing her money, lying to me for decades, he wanted forgiveness. He wanted to die with a clear conscience, absolved by the daughter whose life he'd destroyed. I stood up slowly, looking down at his pathetic, wasted form. For a moment, I let my mask slip. I let him see exactly what I thought of his apology, his confession, his desperate plea for absolution. Forgive you, I repeated, my voice cold as Arctic wind. You want me to forgive you for murdering my mother? His eyes widened in shock. I'd never spoken to him like this before, the perfect daughter finally showing her true face. Sarah, You poisoned her, I continued, my voice gaining strength. You fed her thallium every day for months. You watched her lose her hair, her coordination, her mind. You held her hand while she begged you to make the pain stop, knowing you were the one causing it. How do you... He started, then stopped. The realization was dawning on his face, but he wasn't quite there yet. And when she figured it out, I pressed on, When she offered you forgiveness and a chance at redemption, you killed her anyway. Because your comfort was more important than her life. Because Linda was more important than the woman who'd loved you for 15 years. Sarah, please, I was going to turn myself in. I was going to. No, you weren't. I cut him off. You were going to die and take your secret with you, just like you've done everything else in your miserable, selfish life. Just like you did when you spent mom's life insurance money on a bigger house and expensive cars and jewelry for your mistress. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small vial, the antidote I'd synthesized months ago. Prussian blue, the only known treatment for thallium poisoning. If administered within the first few days, it could save his life. Even now, it might slow the progression enough for the police to arrest him instead of burying him. His eyes fixed on the vial, hope flickering in their depths. What is that? Your cure, I said simply. The medicine that could save your life. The medicine I could have given you months ago. Understanding dawned on his face like a terrible sunrise. You know what's wrong with me. I know exactly what's wrong with you. The same thing that was wrong with Mom. Thallium poisoning. Amazing how similar your symptoms are to hers, isn't it? The color drained from his face, what little color he had left. You're saying someone is poisoning me? I'm saying that justice has a funny way of coming full circle. I watched him process the implications, saw the moment when he realized what I was telling him. His own daughter, the one person he trusted completely, the one person with unlimited access to his food and medication, had been systematically murdering him for months. Sarah, no, you wouldn't. You're nothing like me. You're right, I agreed. I'm nothing like you. When I poison someone, I don't pretend to love them while I do it. I don't lie to them about what's happening. And I don't make them beg for mercy I have no intention of giving. I held up the vial again, letting the light catch the blue liquid inside. This could save you. One injection, and the thallium in your system would be neutralized. You'd live to stand trial for Mom's murder. You'd get to spend the rest of your natural life in prison, thinking about what you did. His breathing had become labored, panic adding to his physical distress. Please, Sarah, I'm your father. I love you. No, you don't, I said matter-of-factly. You love yourself. You've only ever loved yourself. Mom was just an obstacle to your happiness with Linda. I was just a tool to make you look like a grieving widower instead of a murderer. I thought about my childhood in this second life, how I'd watched him play the devoted single father while counting the days until he could officially move Linda into our house. How he'd used my grief as cover for his own guilt. How my academic achievements had become evidence of his excellent parenting rather than my own determination. You know what the worst part is? I continued, settling back into my chair. I actually loved you. In my first life, even after I figured out what you'd done, part of me still wanted to believe you were capable of remorse. That somewhere inside you was a man who could feel guilt for what he'd done to us. I do feel guilty, he gasped. I've felt guilty every day for 23 years. No, you felt inconvenienced. You felt annoyed that your perfect crime came with emotional complications. But if you'd truly felt guilty, you would have confessed. You would have given Mom's money to charity instead of spending it on yourself. You would have told me the truth instead of lying to my face for decades. I placed the vial on his bedside table just out of his reach. His hands were shaking too badly to grab it anyway, and his coordination was shot. Even if he could reach it, he wouldn't be able to open it or inject it properly. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice taking on the clinical tone I used when lecturing medical students. You're going to die, slowly, painfully, exactly like Mom did. Your nervous system will continue to deteriorate until you lose the ability to walk, to speak clearly, to control your bodily functions. In the final stages, you'll experience seizures and respiratory failure. His eyes were wide with terror now, the same terror my mother must have felt when she realized what was happening to her. The police are already investigating her death. They exhumed her body last week. They're going to find the thallium and they're going to arrest you posthumously. Your reputation will be destroyed. Linda will learn what kind of man she married. Everyone will know what you really are. But you, his voice was barely a whisper now, you'll go to prison too, for what you've done to me. I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd given him in years. No, I won't, Because I'm going to be the one who discovers your poisoning. I'm going to be the grieving daughter who demands justice for her father's murder. I'll make sure they test for thallium, and when they find it, I'll help them track down the source. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity and thoroughness. I'd spent months setting up the perfect patsy. Marcus Webb, Linda's abusive ex-boyfriend who'd been stalking her since their breakup 2 years ago. A man with a violent criminal record and a history of threatening both Linda and my father. Marcus had worked until he was fired last month, at Meridian Chemical, a company that produced industrial-grade thallium compounds. Getting him fired had been almost embarrassingly easy. A few anonymous reports about his drinking on the job, some strategically planted evidence of theft, and the company had terminated him without severance. His firing had triggered a predictable spiral of rage and desperation. I'd been monitoring his communications for months through a keylogger I'd installed on his computer during one of his drunken binges. When he'd started making increasingly violent threats against the bastard who stole Linda, I'd known he was ready to be framed. The evidence against Marcus was already in place. Credit card purchases for chemistry equipment made with a cloned card in his name, chemical residue in his apartment planted during a break-in I'd staged to look like one of his own drunken rampages, a detailed journal outlining his plans for revenge, written in handwriting I'd spent weeks learning to replicate. Most damning of all were the text messages I'd sent to Linda from his phone, escalating threats that culminated in a promise to make that old bastard pay for stealing you. Messages sent while Marcus was passed out drunk, too intoxicated to remember what he had or hadn't done. The final piece would be his suicide, scheduled for tonight. Marcus had been drinking heavily since his firing, talking openly about ending it all. When his body was found tomorrow morning with a confession note and an empty bottle of thallium solution beside him, it would complete the narrative perfectly. Obsessed ex-boyfriend kills romantic rival, then takes his own life rather than face the consequences. The media would love the story, and the police would close both cases with a neat bow. I've already planted evidence linking Marcus to your poisoning, I told my father, watching his face crumble as he realized the scope of my planning. False communications suggesting he blamed you for stealing Linda, chemical traces in his apartment that point to thallium synthesis, a manufactured paper trail that leads investigators straight to him? Marcus? Dad's voice was confused, the neurological damage making it hard for him to follow complex information. Linda's ex-boyfriend, the one who's been harassing her since their breakup. He'll be convicted for a crime I committed while I play the role of the victim's devoted daughter seeking justice. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen, a text conversation between Marcus and an unknown number, discussing the purchase of thallium compounds. Of course, the unknown number was a burner phone I controlled, but the police would never trace it back to me. You've thought of everything, he whispered, a mixture of horror and admiration in his voice. I had 23 years to plan this, I replied. 23 years to think about what you did to Mom, what you stole from us, how you destroyed our family for your own selfish gain. Did you really think I'd let you die peacefully in your sleep, surrounded by people who thought you were a good man? The machines around his bed began beeping more urgently as his stress levels spiked. A nurse appeared in the doorway, concerned by the change in his vital signs. Is everything all right? She asked, looking between my father's panicked expression and my carefully composed face. He's having some anxiety about the test results, I explained, standing to speak with her privately. Dr. Matthews mentioned they might need to do more invasive procedures if they can't figure out what's causing his symptoms. Oh, the poor dear, the nurse said sympathetically. These neurological cases are so frightening for families. You're being wonderfully strong for him. He raised me to be strong, I replied, the same words I'd spoken at my mother's funeral. I'll do whatever it takes to take care of him. The nurse smiled and administered a mild sedative to calm my father's agitation. Within minutes, his panic subsided, replaced by a drowsy confusion that made conversation difficult. Perfect for what I needed to do next. I waited until the nurse left, then pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind lawyers use for dictation. My father's eyes widened as he recognized what it was. No, he mumbled through the sedative haze. Sarah, please. You're going to confess, I told him calmly. All of it. What you did to Mom, how you did it, why you did it. A full, detailed confession that will ensure justice is served even after you're gone. I won't, he slurred. Can't make me. Actually, I can. I held up a syringe filled with clear liquid. This is naloxone. It'll counteract the sedative and leave you fully alert and cooperative. Or rather, it'll leave you alert and in excruciating pain as your damaged nervous system tries to process normal sensations. I'd tested this combination on lab rats during my research phase. The naloxone didn't just reverse sedation in subjects with thallium poisoning, it amplified every symptom, turning manageable discomfort into overwhelming agony. Your choice, I continued. Give me a clean confession now, while you're comfortable, or I'll wake you up and you can confess while feeling like your entire body is on fire. He stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally understanding that his loving daughter had become something far more dangerous than he'd ever been. Where his cruelty had been born of selfishness and cowardice, mine was born of righteousness and calculation. Okay, he whispered finally. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Not me, I corrected, pressing a record on the device. Tell the world. Start with your name and today's date, then explain exactly what you did to Catherine Brennan and why. The confession that followed was everything I could have hoped for. In his drugged state, my father was unable to maintain the careful lies he'd constructed over the decades. Instead, he spoke with brutal honesty about his motivations, his methods, and his complete lack of remorse at the time. He detailed how he'd researched various poisons before settling on thallium, attracted by its ability to mimic autoimmune disorders. He described the elaborate performance he'd put on for doctors, friends, and family, playing the devoted husband while systematically murdering his wife. Most damning of all, he admitted to spending her life insurance money immediately, using it to buy Linda expensive gifts and pay for their secret romantic getaways while Mom's body was still warm in the ground. I felt like I'd won the lottery, he said, his words slightly slurred but perfectly clear. Suddenly I had money, I had Linda, I had freedom. It was like Catherine had never existed. When the confession was complete, nearly an hour of devastating admissions, I stopped the recording and uploaded it to 3 different cloud storage accounts. Insurance against any future complications. There, I said, tucking the recorder away. Now you can die knowing that your legacy will be preserved accurately. No more lies about being a devoted husband. No more sympathy for the grieving widower. Just the truth about what you really are. My father had grown quiet during the final portion of his confession, the sedative pulling him toward sleep. But his eyes remained fixed on my face, studying me with a mixture of fear and something that might have been pride. You're so much like your mother, he mumbled. She was always the smartest person in the room, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I'm nothing like her, I replied sharply. She was kind and forgiving. She trusted people who didn't deserve it. She gave second chances to someone who was actively murdering her. But the planning, he continued, his voice growing fainter. The patience. The way you waited 23 years to get your revenge. That's pure Catherine. She always said revenge was a dish best served cold. I frowned. Mom never said that. She did, he insisted, struggling to keep his eyes open. After her sister stole her boyfriend in college. She waited 2 years, then seduced him back just to dump him publicly at her sister's engagement party. She said good revenge requires perfect timing and a complete understanding of your enemy's weaknesses. This was news to me. In both my lives, my mother had seemed incapable of spite or calculated cruelty. She'd been the one preaching forgiveness and understanding, always looking for the good in people. She never told you about her dark side, Dad continued, apparently reading my confusion. But it was there. Underneath all that sweetness was someone who absolutely would not tolerate being crossed. The only reason she never got revenge on me was because she died before she could plan it properly. You're lying, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure. Suddenly, some of my mother's advice took on new meaning. Her emphasis on patience and planning. Her insistence that I always think 3 moves ahead. Her odd calm when dealing with people who had wronged our family. Look in her jewelry box when you get home, Dad whispered. Behind the velvet lining in the bottom drawer, she kept records of everyone who ever hurt her. Plans for getting even. His eyes finally closed, the sedative winning its battle against his will to stay conscious. but his breathing remained steady, and the monitors showed he'd lived through the night. Good. I wanted him awake for his final hours, fully aware of what was happening to him. I drove home in a strange state of emotional suspension, my father's words echoing in my mind. Could it be true? Had my gentle, forgiving mother really been capable of the kind of calculated revenge I'd just orchestrated? The house was dark when I arrived. Linda was visiting her sister for the week, giving me complete privacy to search. I went straight to my parents' old bedroom to the antique jewelry box that had been my mother's most prized possession. The box looked exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, down to the tiny ballerina that pirouetted when you opened the lid. But I'd never explored the hidden compartments that antique jewelry boxes often contained. I found the catch behind the bottom drawer exactly where my father had said it would be. The hidden compartment contained a slim notebook bound in black leather, its pages filled with my mother's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 3 months before her death. The last was written just 2 days before she died. As I read, a completely different picture of my mother emerged. Yes, she'd discovered my father's poisoning attempts, just as he'd confessed. But her reaction hadn't been the tearful forgiveness he'd described. Instead, she'd begun planning a revenge so elaborate and devastating that it would have destroyed not just my father, but Linda, his business partners, and everyone else who had enabled his betrayal. The notebook contained detailed financial records showing how my father had been embezzling from his company to fund his affair. Photos she'd taken of him and Linda together, time-stamped and cataloged. Copies of love letters between them that referenced specific dates when they'd discussed getting rid of the obstacle. But the most chilling section was titled, "After I'm Gone." It contained specific instructions for me, instructions that assumed I would one day discover the truth about her death and seek justice for it. "My darling Sarah," she'd written, "if you're reading this, then Robert has succeeded in killing me, and you've grown up to become the woman I always knew you could be. Strong, smart, ruthless when necessary." The instructions that followed were like a roadmap for everything I'd just accomplished. She'd identified Marcus Webb as the perfect patsy years before I'd even noticed him. She'd documented his violence, his access to chemicals, his obsession with Linda. She'd even suggested the basic framework for framing him. "Patience will be your greatest weapon," she'd written. "Don't rush to judgment or act in anger. Study your enemies until you understand them completely, then strike with precision and overwhelming force." The final entry was a letter addressed directly to my father, meant to be found after her death. "Robert, if you're reading this, then you've finally worked up the courage to search through my things. Congratulations on successfully murdering your wife. I hope the money and your whore were worth it. You always underestimated me, which is why you're going to lose in the end. You think you're clever, but you're just ruthless. There's a difference. Clever people plan for every contingency. Ruthless people just react to immediate obstacles. I've planned for every contingency. The evidence of your embezzlement is already in the hands of a lawyer, sealed with instructions to open it if I die unexpectedly. The photos of you with Linda are hidden where Sarah will find them when she's old enough to understand what they mean. And this notebook will guide her toward a justice more complete than anything the courts could provide. You murdered me because you thought I was weak. But weakness and kindness aren't the same thing, darling. I chose to be kind to you because I loved you. I chose to forgive your small cruelties because I believed you could change. But murder? Murder requires a response in kind. Sleep well, Robert. You're going to need your rest for what's coming." I sat in stunned silence, holding the notebook that reframed my entire understanding of my mother, my childhood, my own nature. All these years, I'd thought I was avenging a gentle woman who'd been too pure for this world. Instead, I'd been carrying out the final wishes of someone who'd been just as capable of calculated cruelty as I was. The apple, it seemed, hadn't fallen far from the tree. My phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. The hospital's number flashed on the screen. "Miss Brennan, this is Nurse Patterson. I'm calling about your father. His condition has taken a turn for the worse. You should come in right away." I glanced at the clock. 3:17 a.m. Right on schedule, according to my calculations. The final stage of thallium poisoning was beginning. "I'll be right there," I said, already gathering my things. When I arrived at the hospital, my father was semi-conscious and struggling to breathe. The neurological damage had progressed to the point where his autonomic nervous system was failing. Dr. Matthews estimated he had perhaps 6 hours left. Perfect timing for Marcus Webb's suicide, which was scheduled for dawn. I sat beside my father's bed, holding his hand while monitoring his vital signs with professional detachment. He drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling words I couldn't quite make out. At 5:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from the burner number I'd been using to impersonate Marcus. A final message to Linda sent automatically using a delayed messaging app. It's over. I can't live with what I've done to him. By the time you read this, I'll be with Catherine. Tell Sarah I'm sorry for taking her father away. M. At 6:15 a.m., Marcus Webb's body would be discovered in his apartment, an empty bottle of thallium solution beside him, and a suicide note confessing to my father's murder. The note would also include details about my mother's death that only the real killer could have known. Details I'd extracted from my father's confession and planted in Marcus's apartment weeks ago. The beauty of the setup was that Marcus's suicide would actually be a drug overdose, a massive dose of fentanyl that would kill him instantly and leave no trace of foul play. To the world, it would look like a man consumed by guilt who'd chosen to end his life rather than face justice for his crimes. At 6:45 a.m., my father's breathing became increasingly labored. The machines around his bed began sounding alarms as his vital signs crashed. I pressed the call button and stepped back, allowing the medical team to rush in and attempt their futile resuscitation efforts. Time of death, 7:23 a.m., Dr. Matthews announced, his voice heavy with the weight of a case that had baffled him for months. I collapsed into the chair beside the bed, letting out a sob that was equal parts performance and genuine relief. 23 years of planning had finally reached its conclusion. I'm so sorry for your loss, Dr. Matthews said, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. I know how hard you fought to find answers for him. I just want to know what killed him, I said through carefully orchestrated tears. He deserved better than this. Our whole family has been through so much. We'll do a complete autopsy, he assured me, and given the unusual nature of his symptoms, we'll run extensive toxicology panels. If there's something we missed, we'll find it. I nodded gratefully, knowing exactly what they would find. Within 48 hours, the autopsy would reveal massive thallium poisoning. The police would be called, an investigation would begin, and Marcus Webb's body would already be cooling in the morgue with his confession note beside him. 2 hours later, I was sitting in Detective Santos's office, playing the shocked and grieving daughter to perfection. Dr. Brennan, she said gently, I'm very sorry for your loss. But I have to ask, given the circumstances surrounding your mother's death, and now this, do you have any idea who might have wanted to hurt your father? I can't imagine anyone wanting to hurt him, I said, dabbing at my eyes with a tissue. He was such a good man. But I paused, as if something had just occurred to me. There was someone who'd been bothering Linda, her ex-boyfriend. He'd been making threats. Marcus Webb, Detective Santos said, consulting her notes. We're already looking into him. In fact, we found his body this morning. Apparent suicide with a note confessing to your father's murder? My eyes widened in perfectly feigned shock. He's dead? But why would he want to hurt my father? What did Dad ever do to him? According to the note, Mr. Webb blamed your father for stealing Linda from him. He also confessed to your mother's murder, claiming he'd been planning revenge against your family for years. I shook my head in disbelief. That's impossible. Mom died when I was just a child. Marcus would have been a teenager then. How could he have... We're investigating all possibilities, Detective Santos assured me. But the evidence is quite compelling. We found thallium residue in his apartment, along with detailed plans for poisoning your father. And the confession note included details about your mother's death that were never made public. So it's over? I asked hopefully. We finally know what happened to both of them? It looks that way. We'll need you to identify some evidence and answer a few more questions, but yes, I believe we've solved both cases. The next few weeks passed in a blur of media attention and legal proceedings. The story of the Webb family murders, as they came to be known, captivated the public imagination. A disturbed young man, obsessed with his ex-girlfriend who'd committed a decades-long campaign of revenge against her new family. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity. Marcus had poisoned my mother when he was 19, driven by juvenile jealousy and rage. He'd then waited over 20 years to complete his revenge, poisoning my father when his own life had fallen apart. I gave several interviews, always presenting myself as the tragic daughter who'd lost both parents to the same killer. The media loved the angle, the brilliant toxicologist who'd helped solve her own family's murders, turning personal tragedy into professional purpose. I became a doctor because I wanted to understand what happened to my mother. I told Anderson Cooper in a primetime special. I specialized in toxicology because I needed to know how someone could do something so evil to another human being. I never imagined that knowledge would help me find justice for both my parents. The interview was watched by over 15 million people. I received hundreds of letters from other crime victims, thanking me for my strength and inspiration. Harvard Medical School invited me to give a lecture on forensic toxicology. The FBI asked me to consult on several cold cases involving suspected poisoning. I had become the face of justice triumphing over evil, the daughter who'd never given up on finding the truth about her family's destruction. If only they knew the truth was far more complex and beautiful than they could imagine. 3 months after my father's death, I received a call from the family lawyer. My father's will had been processed, and I was the sole beneficiary of his estate. $2 million in life insurance, plus the house, his business interests, and various investments. I donated a substantial portion to charities supporting domestic violence victims and medical research. The gesture generated more positive press and cemented my reputation as someone who'd turned tragedy into a force for good. But I kept enough to ensure my complete financial independence. Money my father had stolen from my mother returned to its rightful heir through the long arc of justice. I also inherited Linda, in a sense. With my father dead and Marcus branded as her stalker killer, she had nowhere else to turn. She was completely alone in the world, cut off from friends who now viewed her as a victim of elaborate manipulation. The guilt was eating her alive. She'd loved my father, genuinely loved him, and learning that their entire relationship had been built on my mother's murder had shattered her worldview. She'd come to me seeking answers, forgiveness, some way to make sense of what her life had become. I never knew, she told me over coffee, her eyes red from constant crying. If I'd known what he'd done to your mother, I never would have. God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I helped him spend her money. I lived in the house he bought with her life insurance. How can you even stand to look at me? Because you're a victim, too, I told her gently. You were manipulated by a murderer. You couldn't have known what kind of man he really was. It was true in its way. Linda wasn't evil, just weak and naive. She'd been the perfect mark for my father's manipulation. Young, impressionable, easily dazzled by money and attention. In another life, she might have been a good person. But she'd still benefited from my mother's murder. She'd still spent 20 years enjoying luxuries paid for with blood money. And that required some form of justice, even if she didn't deserve the full weight of my father's punishment. So I offered her kindness mixed with subtle psychological torture. I invited her to family dinners where I'd share memories of my mother, watching Linda's face crumple with guilt. I gave her photo albums from my parents' early marriage, letting her see the happiness my father had destroyed for her sake. Most effectively, I gave her my mother's jewelry, pieces my father had hidden away after her death. Too guilty to let Linda wear them, but too greedy to sell them. She would have wanted you to have these, I lied, watching Linda's hands shake as she held my mother's wedding ring. She always said that love shouldn't die with the person who felt it. Linda moved away 6 months later, unable to bear the constant reminders of her unwitting participation in my father's crimes. I never heard from her again, but I occasionally checked her social media accounts. She'd developed a drinking problem and was living alone in a small apartment, working as a waitress to pay rent. Perfect. A lifetime of guilt and diminished circumstances, punishment proportional to her crimes. With all loose ends tied up, I finally felt free to build the life my mother had always wanted for me. I met David at a medical conference the following year, a pediatric surgeon with kind eyes and gentle hands who knew nothing about my family's history beyond what he'd seen in the news. He was impressed by my strength, my dedication to justice, my ability to turn tragedy into purpose. When he proposed 18 months later, I said yes with tears in my eyes. Real tears this time, because for the first time since my mother's death, I was genuinely happy. We married in a small ceremony with my mother's portrait prominently displayed among the flowers. I carried her wedding ring as my something old, and I whispered a promise to her as I walked down the aisle. I would build the life she'd always wanted me to have. Our honeymoon was everything my mother had dreamed of. 3 weeks in Italy, visiting all the places she'd planned to see with my father before he'd murdered her instead. I took photos at every location, creating the travel album she'd never had the chance to fill. David and I settled into a beautiful house in the hills overlooking the city, far from the memories and ghosts of my childhood home. We talked about starting a family, about the children we'd raise with love and honesty and respect. I thought about the stories I'd tell those children about their grandmother, how brilliant she'd been, how much she'd loved them even before they existed, how her death had motivated everything I'd accomplished. They would grow up knowing they came from a legacy of intelligence and strength, never suspecting the darker currents that had shaped their family tree. They would never know about their grandfather. As far as they'd be concerned, he'd died when I was young, before they could meet him. Another victim of a senseless crime, best forgotten. The truth would die with me. 2 years after my marriage, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Detective Santos, now retired, had stopped by to congratulate me on a recent award I'd received for contributions to forensic toxicology. "You've done remarkable things," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Your parents would be so proud of what you've accomplished." "Thank you," I replied, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't a purely social visit. "I've been thinking about the Webb case lately," she continued, her eyes studying my reaction carefully. "It was such a strange situation. So many coincidences and perfect timing." My pulse quickened slightly, but I kept my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "Well, for instance, the way Marcus's apartment was broken into just weeks before your father's death. Nothing stolen, but it would have given someone access to plant evidence. And the suicide note. The handwriting was a perfect match for Marcus's, but something about the phrasing seemed educated, more sophisticated than his usual communication style." I frowned, playing the confused innocent. "Are you suggesting Marcus didn't kill my parents?" "Oh no," Detective Santos said quickly. "The evidence was overwhelming. I'm just saying that someone very smart helped put that evidence together. Someone who understood exactly how to build an airtight case." We stared at each other for a long moment, two professionals who understood the difference between legal proof and absolute certainty. "If someone had helped," I said carefully, "hypothetically speaking, what would you think about that?" "Hypothetically?" Detective Santos smiled. "I'd think that justice took a long time to find your family, but it finally got there. And I'd think that sometimes the system needs help from people who understand it better than most." She stood to leave and then paused at my office door. "Your mother's journal," she said casually. "The one we found in the evidence from her original case file. She was quite a planner, wasn't she? Very detail-oriented, very patient." My blood turned to ice. "What journal?" "The one where she documented your father's affair and her suspicions about the poisoning. Remarkable foresight, really. It was like she knew exactly what you'd need to prove his guilt, decades before you'd be in a position to use it." Detective Santos winked and walked out, leaving me alone with the realization that even my perfect crime hadn't been perfect enough to fool everyone. But it didn't matter. Legal proof and personal certainty were two different things, and she'd never have enough of the former to matter. More importantly, she didn't seem to want it. In her mind, justice had been served, and the method was less important than the result. I was safe, my family was safe, and my mother's murder had been avenged in full. That night, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, surrounded by the flowers my mother had loved. The sun was setting over the city below, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I thought about the long journey that had brought me here. 2 lifetimes of pain and planning, of patience and precision. I thought about my father's final moments, when he'd finally understood what it felt like to be powerless and afraid. I thought about my mother's journal, with its careful instructions for a revenge she'd never lived to see executed. Most of all, I thought about the children David and I would have and the peaceful life we'd build together on the foundation of perfect justice. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Dinner's ready when you are. Love you. I finished my wine and headed inside, leaving the garden to the gathering darkness. Behind me, the flowers my mother had loved swayed gently in the evening breeze, beautiful and serene in the fading light. Justice, I reflected, really was a dish best served cold. But once it's finally served, it tastes exactly like peace,